Throughout her life, Madame Ella worked and lived for her family, unaware that in her later years she would become incurably ill. Daily visits to the doctor changed nothing. Symptoms only added to the diagnosis already made. Desperate to fight the disease, Ella decided to live out her remaining days. Her children and grandchildren supported her as best they could, visiting more often. On this day, Ella wasn't expecting anyone, but someone unexpectedly rang the doorbell. She opened it to find her sister on the doorstep, breathless as if she had unloaded a wagon of coal. "It takes all your strength just to get up here. Can't they bother to fix the elevator?" Ella shrugged and replied. "I've been waiting for them to fix it for a while, but they either have no money or the workers are off on a spree." Ella led her sister into the apartment, then went to the kitchen to boil water for tea. From there, she asked, "Why so early?" "I've just woken up." Her relative was sitting in the living room, flipping through a newspaper. "I've been given a recipe for herbs, they said it would help you. So, I rushed to tell you, hoping to make you happy." Ella peeked out from the kitchen and said, "I don't believe anyone. There are so many charlatans around, it's hopeless." Her sister looked at her reproachfully and replied, "What are you afraid of? Perhaps you regret spending money on your treatment? Surely your late husband left you some inheritance." "I have nothing. I barely managed to bury my husband, I had to collect money from neighbors." Tamara stood up and walked around the room. "That sounds like you. Better to let the wealth rot than to give it to anyone." Ella knew what she was talking about but didn't want to tell Tamara the truth. She hadn't preserved the family values just to squander them later. She couldn't help herself, the only question was who deserved the inheritance. Her granddaughter, who had been admitted to the institute and was in need of money, seemed most deserving. But how to do it without offending the others? The old lady thought about it and came up with the idea to simply hint to her granddaughter about the inheritance. And that was her fatal mistake. Soon, relatives would begin to openly quarrel over the jewels. But Ella would find out about this later, shocked by the discovered jewels. After all, her husband had asked her not to touch the valuables and to keep them as a memory before he died. Ella saw her sister out and began searching for documents that could give any clue about the inheritance. Then the phone rang, and it seemed to the old lady that everyone decided to pay her attention that day. But it was her granddaughter. As the saying goes, the game comes to the hunter. She picked up the phone and answered, "I was just thinking about you." The grandmother was pleased and said, "It's good, grandmother, that you remember me. I'm calling because we have a short break in the session and I'd like to come to you." Ella happily replied, "Of course, come over, it will be more fun together. I'm lonely here by myself. My sister came today, but we didn't talk for long. Olga promised to come over on the weekend." The granddaughter hung up and pondered. It seemed to Ella that her granddaughter sensed there was something to inherit. But soon Ella dismissed the unpleasant thoughts. Her granddaughter couldn't act like that, especially not knowing about the jewels. And Ella herself didn't know exactly where they were or what was hidden there. Her husband had only vaguely mentioned where he had put the box. But then, when he fell ill, he stopped talking about it. Ella remembered that in the documents, he had drawn a detailed plan of where the box was located. She just needed to review his notes to understand which led to the find. And then she had another brilliant idea, to use her granddaughter's knowledge. She had excellent grades in drawing and drafting at school, so Olga would understand maps and know the difference between schematic drawings and mere scribbles. Olga arrived the next day, bringing a whole library with her, figuratively speaking, though she only had a couple of dozen books in her backpack. The old lady was surprised and asked, "Why so much literature?" The granddaughter laughed and replied, "Grandma, it's important to keep your mind filled with fresh information." And then she immediately opened her phone and started searching the internet. Ella sighed deeply and muttered to herself, "Yes, the internet definitely has fresh information. Probably, your teacher foisted those books on you, and you were too embarrassed to refuse." Olga felt a bit embarrassed and replied, "You're right, as always." I didn't expect your deduction skills to awaken in your old age. The old lady smirked and remarked, I've always been good at analyzing things, you just never noticed. Then she remembered that she had prepared a Charlotte for her granddaughter's visit. You must be hungry, let's go have some tea. Together, they went to the kitchen and sat at the table. Looking at Olga's textbooks, Ella thought that her granddaughter would have no trouble finding the necessary paper among her husband's documents. But how to steer the girl into a serious conversation? Then Ella decided to invent a story. Listen, your grandfather and I once buried our wishes in a box, and now I can't find it. Olga looked at her grandmother and asked again, what do you mean, wishes? You always were open with him. Ella explained that they wanted to create intrigue, but the trouble was, the box was hidden at the dacha, and she didn't know where exactly. And she wanted Olga to go through her grandfather's papers and find the answer. The granddaughter's eyes lit up. Grandma, it feels like we're going to look for treasure. The old lady's throat dried up at these words. Well, a real treasure, that's stretching it. To not show her excitement, Ella left the kitchen. I'll go water the flowers, or they'll wilt. Olga suspected nothing because she continued to drink tea and browse the internet for news. In the evening, when the grandmother went to bed, the girl called her parents. She wanted to share the news that Grandma was looking for a secret box. Naturally, her mother answered the phone, as Olga only trusted her secrets to her. Mrs. Ksenia listened carefully to her daughter and replied, I think Grandma hasn't told you everything. I remember your dad talking to your grandfather, and he once mentioned that he hid some jewels. We didn't believe him, but now it turns out that our grandma decided to keep them for herself. On one hand, she had the right to, but from the perspective of family relations, it's better to share. Ella knew there was no cure for her illness, so she could have told the whole truth about the inheritance. But for some reason, she kept silent. Olga kept the conversation with her mother a secret, not wanting to startle the old lady. She woke up in the morning and came into her room. I see you had a sleepless night, probably read half of those books. Olga shook her head no. No, I was thinking about how we'll sort through Grandpa's documents. Ella left for a minute, then came back with a pile of papers. Handing them to her granddaughter, she said, Here, no rush, take your time to study them, then tell me what you find. In front of the girl were archival records, as they could be called, because some were dated a decade ago. Ella left the room, and Olga started sorting through the documents. On top were some lists. They were of little interest. She needed a scheme or a hand-drawn plan, but nothing like that appeared yet. Then Olga decided to use a selection method. She set aside half of the documents and only kept those that had yellowed with time. There weren't many, but among them, she found a plan. Whether it was an indicator to the box. The girl didn't know, and to keep the secret a bit longer, she called her mother. Olga informed her that she found a scheme but didn't yet know how to search for the jewels by it. Ksenia decided to caution her daughter. Don't tell Grandma about the map in your hands. If she asks, say you found nothing. It sounded selfish, but Olga herself wanted to get to the treasure as soon as possible. An hour and a half later, the old lady returned and asked, So, any results? Anything to boast about? Olga answered that she found nothing among the documents. Ella was disappointed and took the papers back. I knew it, your grandpa got it all mixed up and didn't hide it on the plot. She muttered something as she retreated to her room. While the granddaughter was already hiding the map in her backpack. That same day, Olga returned home and handed the document to her mother. Here. This is all I managed to find. Mrs. Ksenia looked at the yellow piece of paper and asked. What do you think yourself? How should we search for the jewels? The girl shrugged and said, You've often been to the cottage, right? And you know how everything is arranged there? I think you won't have trouble figuring it out. Ksenia looked at the map again and said, Fine, I'll give it to your father, let him figure it out. Realizing she couldn't find the inheritance herself, Ella decided to gather her children and grandchildren. She wanted to tell them about the family secret. But she had no idea that her loved ones were already fully engaged in searching for the valuables. News of the treasure even reached distant relatives. They too joined the search, but so far without success. The map was with Ksenia, so only she could pinpoint the location of the stash accurately. A few days later, everyone gathered in her apartment, and they even had to move some furniture to make room for everyone. Ella started the conversation by telling the backstory of the box. Olga and her parents knew about this, so they didn't pay much attention to the details of the story. The other relatives listened with open mouths, but they did so not to upset the old lady. The secret was known. But it was important to create an atmosphere of secrecy. Ella managed this, or so she thought, as she looked at the faces of the invited relatives. After the conversation, they discussed some more and then dispersed. As soon as they left the old lady's apartment, they immediately went searching. The map was with Ksenia, who led the charge. Her husband, as promised, worked on the scheme and now roughly knew where to dig. Arriving at the cottage, Olga and her mom were surprised to see that someone had been digging in the garden with shovels. It was clear they were looking for treasure, but found nothing, otherwise, it would have been known. Then Ksenia took out the map and called her husband. "Look at the scheme and show where to dig. Just don't say you have no ideas." Her husband smiled guiltily and suggested starting with the gazebo. They often spent their free time there. Maybe the grandfather had buried the jewels there. They spent several hours but found nothing. Then the gate opened, and Ella entered the yard. She was holding a bag, but nobody knew what was inside. The granddaughter approached her first. "Grandma, I'm sorry it turned out this way. I found the map, but didn't tell my parents about it." The old lady looked at her and replied, "I'm not angry because I found the box myself, and I told you so you'd visit me more often. I wanted to see what you would do when you learned about the treasure." Ksenia and her husband stood aside, unsure how to react. Ella approached them and hugged them. "Don't worry, you're doing well financially. Let them stay as a memory of grandfather." Then the grandmother opened the bag and took out a box. Everyone's eyes lit up. Each waited for her to pull out a necklace or a bracelet, but it turned out to be much more mundane. In the box was costume jewelry and a message from the grandfather. He thanked everyone for finding the box. It meant the family hadn't fallen apart. That's what the old man was worried about, because he knew about his wife's incurable disease. Everyone laughed and took an item each. Ksenia realized that life should be lived for the family, not for some mythical values. And the husband handed the map back to the old lady with the words, "You really taught us a lesson we'll never forget. Forget.